Hi, my name's Troy. I'm the dyslexia expert
And I'm Lisa. I'm his wife, who's not a dyslexia expert.
and business partner and executive functioning. Those of you who follow me know I have ADHD. And welcome back to Dyslexia Chats with Cats. Hopefully, one of our cats will join us this time.
So today I think we want to talk about a little bit about the U.S. Special education system and why so many people's kids are struggling, particularly with reading, but then not getting special education support. So what can you tell us about that?
So, that's a really good question. I'm actually going to start with something that's a little bit controversial. Most research on the US school system, and that's what I'm an expert in, is the United States school system, is predicated on this idea of RTI, or now more commonly known as MTSS. And what that means is that RTI is response to intervention, MTSS is multi tiered systems of support. In theory, everyone in a school is supposed to be in what they call tier one. That's the regular instruction that everybody gets. And in theory, about 70% of students should have their needs met by tier one. For that 30% who doesn't have their needs met, we are supposed to have a tier two, which is when kids get pulled out for small group interventions. And that can be in reading, it can be in math, it can be in executive functioning or behavior, anything that they need help with. And then we have this tier three, which is where we start having conversations about special education. And that's supposed to be a really small number of kids. And I'm sure you're listening to me and saying, but that's not how my school works. Exactly. The first thing to understand about the school system is that it is deeply under resourced. The amount of personnel and materials that we would need to actually implement MTSS is huge. And I have never worked at a school that was even close to being able to implement it as designed. So, one of the first things to recognize is that this on paper, these tier two structures exist for kids who have dyslexia and for kids who are struggling to read for various reasons. In practice, many schools don't have the interventionists to be able to do these kind of interventions.
So what advice do you have for somebody whose child either has dyslexia or that they suspect have dyslexia in regards to their school?
So, unfortunately, because of the way that the system is structured, and if you can't tell, I'm not a fan of MTSS. I think that if we actually funded it, it would be great. But I think that as we actually implement it, it's a disaster. And the research has actually sort of borne that out. It has not improved outcomes, it has had the opposite effect. That being said, um, the system that does exist for students with disabilities is US special education system, which is governed by the Exceptional Children's Education Act. And so the first thing that I would do if you notice that your student is struggling is I would speak to the teacher. I would ask about potential intervention services or maybe even potential special education services and see what the school says. A couple of things to keep in mind. The way that you qualify for special education in a specific learning disability, which is special education lingo for things like dyslexia, dyscalculia, dysgraphia, is you have to be on a trajectory where it is going to take you a significant volume of time to catch up to grade level. And you have to be provided an intervention, and that intervention has to be shown not to work. Because again, the assumption is that 70% of kids, which is never happens, are being served in tier one, and that about most of the other 30% are being served in tier two, which again we know is not actually one of our cats is thinking about coming over, which we know is not actually how that goes. So if your child is really young, it's very, very difficult in the way the system is structured to qualify as having a specific learning disability. And you can go to a private practitioner and get a private diagnosis, but the criteria that a private diagnostician uses is different from the criteria that a school uses. So a lot of times parents get really confused because they'll go to a private practitioner. That practitioner will recommend an IEP. They'll come to the school, and the school will say, actually, this child doesn't qualify for an IEP. It's really frustrating for parents, and so you need to be aware that that's a real possibility. With that being said, there's a couple of tricks that you can use to try to engage the special education process. Is there anything else I should talk about before I start talking about those tricks?
Yeah, I think you covered it.
Okay. So the first thing is, if you want to request anything related to special education, always do so in writing. Because if you just have an informal request, an informal conversation, what is very likely to happen is that the school will call you and say, hey, we'd like to try this, this, and this, and give these time to work and see what happens. And oftentimes that's a reasonable course of action, but sometimes it isn't. And if you agree to that, then they will tend not to do anything formal in regards to the special education process. But if you request special education testing in writing, the school has uh, a small amount of time in which it is legally obligated to respond, and they have to do a formal response. They have to either issue what's called a prior written notice explaining why they're not going to test, or more often, if you are insistent and you have done so in writing, they'll just agree to test. That is probably the first thing to know about schools. The second thing is, if you have to remember when you're dealing with a school that you're dealing with an overworked, overstressed, underfunded entity, and that a lot of the supports the school has or is supposed to have exist on paper, but not so much in real life. The funding and the personnel just aren't there for those supports. So once you've engaged in this special education and the special education testing process, my advice always is do your best to work with the school. If the school doesn't have the resources to provide a certain intervention, trying to push them to do that intervention is likely to result in a haphazard, poorly implemented solution. If a school isn't structured to provide a certain service, you might be able to get that service on the IEP, but the school's probably not going to provide it very well. You almost always will do better. I'm sure you can hear our cats, they'll come. You almost always will do better if you work with the school and try to work within that system to get the best possible support for your kids. Once you start to be combative and to have, this is Mika, and to have an adversarial relationship with the school, they usually will be very careful how they communicate because they'll be worried about a litigation risk and they won't talk to you as freely. If a school really is doing something egregious, usually it's easier to switch schools. And if you can't switch schools, that's when I would advise potentially going down some of the pathways that are available if a school is not following the law.
So, what sorts of things should, if someone, I have two follow-up questions. If
Okay.
somebody's child has an IEP, what sorts of things should they be looking for on that IEP that would be good supports for most kids that have dyslexia?
It's a really good question. So there's two things that are really important on an IEP. One, three, I would say. Everything on an IEP is important. These are the three things that are the most important if you're not used to reading IEPs. Number one is the services. The services are the supports that a child is guaranteed to get. So if it says that they get 150 minutes a week of special education services and literacy, by law, the school has to provide that. So you want to make sure that the amount of service time is reasonably likely to accomplish whatever the IEP goals are. The second thing that's really important to look at are the goals. When you see things like a student will get to a level F or a DRA 24, those should raise red flags for you because what's happening is the school is using a system of leveled text, which the research really doesn't support. You want to see goals that are around fluency, how many words a student can read and how accurately within a certain period of time, usually a minute, phonics, phonemic awareness, and those kinds of things. And then also, the last thing I would look at is there's a spot on an IEP where it says accommodations. There's no earthly reason that a student with dyslexia should not have oral presentation. Things should be being read to them. And ideally, I would say some sort of technology for spelling, like word prediction, would be really good as well. And a thing to keep in mind as well is if you don't qualify for an IEP, you cannot get services, you cannot get instruction, but you can get accommodations in the United States under something called a 504. And that can provide you the same accommodations that an IEP can. So if you're denied for an IEP, I would really push for that so that at least you can get those accommodations and supports that your kid needs.
My other follow-up question was going to be if my child doesn't qualify for an IEP, what are some things I can do? So you mentioned a 504. Are there any other things that you would recommend for somebody in that case?
So there is a process called due process. Essentially, it's a little bit like going into the courts or an arbitration. Schools have to follow special education laws. And there is a time and a place, either if you are trying to fix a system for, the next families coming through, or if you don't really have the option of changing schools and a school is doing an unacceptably poor job of meeting a student's needs or just simply not following the law, you can go through that process. I strongly recommend, long before you even consider that, wherever you are, there are almost certainly special education advocates. And if you're in a big city, there's probably special education advocates who will work for free. There's lots of organizations that help families out. So that is always an option. You can go through the school is not following the law. I'm going to use the law's enforcement mechanisms route. Again, save that for emergencies. The thing that I would start with is understanding why the student is not qualifying for an IEP, and then working with the school to say, okay, I understand that this is a problem. What is the plan for my child? And if
So just to interrupt you a little bit, because you're answering a
Mhm.
question that's a valid question, but I also you mentioned earlier that legally the school's obligation for helping with a learning disability is different from a medical diagnosis.
Correct.
So there will be lots of kids who will be potentially diagnosed with dyslexia who will not be struggling enough to qualify for an IEP, in which case the school will have been meeting their legal obligation, but the student is still struggling. So
Mhm.
what should families in that instance do?
Right. So a thing to keep in mind there is, according to Dr. Shaywitz, about 20% of people are potentially diagnosable with dyslexia. Only about 12 to 14% of a school population will have an IEP, and that doesn't just include dyslexia. That includes math disabilities, intellectual disabilities, emotional disabilities. So a lot of students with dyslexia won't qualify for those supports. And this is where the system gets really frustrating, I think, for a lot of families. The best advice that I have would be talk to your teacher, talk to your school, and insist that there be a plan to help your kid. And if they can't give you a plan, then you can keep pushing. But even if they can't provide an IEP, they do need to do something to have some plan, some idea of how to help your kid succeed. And most of the time, if families are wanting to work with the teacher and support the teacher, most teachers want their kids to succeed too. That's a thing that a teacher is going to be willing to work with you on. At the same time, um, if you are working through this, it's important to understand what kinds of programs your school has and whether they really are qualified to help. So there's this idea about how we learn to read called three cueing, which is really not based in the research and turns out just not to be accurate. A lot of schools are still using programs that are based on the outdated ideas like three cueing, and those programs aren't helping anyone learn how to read and can actually be harmful. So if you want to know if your school's using a valid, high quality program, I would look on. There's the Center for Effective Reading Instruction, CERI. There's
Which is,
IMSLEC, IMSLEC.
yeah,
I can't remember what that stands for. But you can evaluate whether your school has a good program, and if not, you can help advocate and reform there. There's usually parents. And then same thing, just make sure that there are goals and that you have a way to track whether your kid's meeting those goals so that you know when it's time to escalate and ask for an IEP.
great. Thank you so much.
Yep. Thank you guys for joining us.
Drop your questions, comments. Please like and subscribe.
Please share our videos. We want to help as many people as we can, and hopefully you guys will get to see Mika again.